Right now, the world is experiencing something familiar, although very few people recognize it for what it is. Because the language has changed, the technology is newer, and the institutions look more sophisticated. Yet, beneath the surface, the same economic forces are quietly reassembling themselves. The same pressures are building, and the same mistakes are being repeated in a system that believes it has already learned its lesson. Prices are not falling back to where they were supposed to. Wages are rising, but never quite fast enough. Energy costs are refusing to stabilize. Food commodities are moving in slow but relentless waves, and policymakers are speaking in carefully chosen phrases like sticky inflation, temporary persistence, and soft landings. Phrases that are meant to reassure rather than explain, because the explanation would require admitting that this pattern has already played out once before, with consequences that reshaped an entire generation. To understand why 2026 looks less like a temporary disruption and more like a historical echo, it is necessary to return to a decade that modern financial systems were designed to forget, not because it was irrelevant, but because it exposed the limits of control, the fragility of credibility, and the cost of trying to manage inflation without confronting its structural causes. The 1970s were not supposed to happen, at least not according to the economic consensus of the time, because the post-war world had been built on the assumption that inflation could be fine-tuned, employment could be optimized, and growth could be smoothed through expert management. Yet what unfolded instead was a decade defined by scarcity, rising prices, falling confidence, and a slow erosion of trust in money itself. At the start of that decade, the United States appeared unshakable. The dollar was still anchored to global dominance, energy was cheap, productivity was strong, and consumer confidence was high. But beneath that stability sat a series of unresolved imbalances, including expanding government spending, persistent budget deficits, rising entitlement costs, and a monetary system stretched thin by its own promises. In 1971, when the United States formally severed the dollar's final link to gold, the decision was presented as a technical adjustment, a necessary step to protect economic flexibility. But in reality, it marked the beginning of a new monetary era in which discipline would be enforced not by scarcity, but by trust, and trust would become the most fragile asset of all. Once that anchor was removed, inflation no longer needed a single dramatic catalyst, because it could now emerge from accumulation rather than shock, building gradually through wage negotiations, supply constraints, fiscal expansion, and monetary accommodation, all reinforcing one another in ways that were difficult to reverse without imposing real pain. Energy prices became the visible trigger, but not the root cause, as oil embargoes and geopolitical tensions merely exposed a system already vulnerable to cost-push inflation, where higher input prices fed directly into consumer prices, forcing workers to demand higher wages, which then increased production costs, creating a cycle that fed on itself. Central banks, operating under models that assumed inflation and unemployment could be traded against one another, hesitated to act decisively, fearing that tightening policy would trigger recession, while easing policy would preserve growth, a choice that proved illusory because inflation does not negotiate once expectations become unanchored. By the late 1970s, inflation was no longer a temporary inconvenience, but a structural condition embedded in contracts, pricing behavior, and household psychology, where people spent quickly not because they were irresponsible, but because money lost value simply by being held. This is the crucial parallel to the present moment, because inflation is not just a number on a chart, but a behavioral force. And once it becomes embedded in expectations, it reshapes decision-making across the entire economy, from corporate investment to household savings. In 2026, the world finds itself in a remarkably similar position, although the catalysts appear different on the surface, with supply chain disruptions, energy transitions, geopolitical fragmentation, and demographic pressures replacing oil embargoes and Cold War tensions, yet the underlying dynamic remains unchanged, as rising costs encounter systems unwilling or unable to impose restraint. Commodity prices, particularly in energy, metals, and food, have demonstrated a pattern of persistence rather than volatility, moving in sustained ranges rather than sharp spikes, which is precisely the condition that defined inflation in the 1970s, where prices did not explode overnight, but crept steadily higher, month after month, eroding purchasing power without triggering immediate crisis. Labor markets, tight for structural reasons rather than cyclical ones, have contributed to wage pressures that feed directly into services inflation, a category notoriously resistant to monetary tightening, because it reflects human labor rather than speculative demand. At the same time, government debt levels have reached heights that make aggressive disinflation politically and fiscally painful, because higher interest rates translate directly into rising debt service costs, forcing policymakers into a narrow corridor where inflation must be tolerated rather than eliminated. This is not a failure of intelligence, but a constraint of arithmetic. Because once debt reaches a certain scale relative to economic output, the cost of restoring price stability begins to compete with the sustainability of the system itself. In the 1970s, policymakers delayed confronting this reality, hoping that inflation would resolve itself through temporary adjustments, but instead the delay allowed inflation expectations to harden, making the eventual correction far more severe when it finally arrived. When Paul Volcker took control of the Federal Reserve at the end of that decade, he did not introduce a new theory, but rather imposed an old discipline, raising interest rates to levels that crushed inflation at the cost of recession, unemployment, and political backlash. A decision that restored credibility but left lasting scars. The lesson was clear, although often ignored, that inflation can be postponed but not negotiated away, and that the longer it is tolerated, the higher the eventual cost of restoring trust in money. In 2026, central banks speak of patience, balance, and data dependence, yet markets respond less to words than to credibility. And credibility erodes not through sudden collapse, but through repeated small deviations between promises and outcomes. The reemergence of commodity-driven inflation is particularly telling because commodities anchor the physical economy, setting the baseline for everything from transportation to housing to food. And when those inputs rise persistently, the inflation they generate cannot be reversed by financial tightening alone. This was precisely the challenge of the 1970s, where monetary tools proved blunt against real-world constraints, forcing policymakers into a choice between tolerating inflation or imposing recession, a trade-off that remains unresolved today. The global economy of the 2020s is more interconnected, more leveraged, and more dependent on complex supply chains than its predecessor, which means that inflationary shocks propagate faster and linger longer, while policy responses are constrained by political fragmentation and social pressure. Energy transitions, while necessary for long-term sustainability, introduce short-term cost pressures that mirror the energy shocks of the past, as capital investment struggles to keep pace with demand, and price stability becomes collateral damage in a broader structural shift. Food inflation, driven by climate volatility and geopolitical disruption, adds another layer of persistence because food is not discretionary, and rising prices force adjustments elsewhere in household budgets, amplifying the perception of economic decline even when headline indicators remain stable. The result is a slow erosion of confidence, not dramatic enough to trigger panic, but persistent enough to alter behavior as households save less in real terms, seek inflation hedges, and lose faith in long-term planning, conditions that define the lived experience of the 1970s more than any single statistic. What ultimately broke the Great Inflation was not technological progress or globalization, but credibility, restored through painful adjustment. A reminder that inflation is as much a political and psychological phenomenon as it is a monetary one. The uncomfortable parallel is that credibility cannot be preserved indefinitely through reassurance alone, and that systems which rely on confidence must occasionally demonstrate restraint to maintain it. In the 1970s, the delay in confronting inflation transformed a manageable problem into a generational event, reshaping asset markets, labor relations, and political priorities for decades to come. In 2026, the conditions for a similar outcome are present, not because history repeats mechanically, but because human incentives remain unchanged, and systems under pressure tend to choose delay over discipline until delay becomes impossible. The return of inflation is not an anomaly, but a reminder that monetary stability is not a permanent achievement, but a continuous process, vulnerable to complacency and constrained by reality. The lesson of the Great Inflation was never that it could not happen again, but that it would look different the next time, wearing new language, new tools, and new justifications, while obeying the same underlying rules. What history suggests, without prediction or alarm, is that inflation does not announce its departure, and that periods of apparent stability often mask deeper structural adjustments still unfolding beneath the surface. The 1970s did not end because people grew tired of inflation, but because the cost of avoiding it became higher than the cost of confronting it, a threshold that every monetary system eventually reaches. Whether 2026 represents that threshold or merely another delay is not yet clear, but the resemblance is no longer coincidental and the pattern is no longer obscure. Inflation does not return because lessons are forgotten, but because circumstances change, incentives shift, and the discipline required to preserve stability becomes politically inconvenient. History does not repeat exactly, but it does remember. And when it does, it rarely arrives without warning.